Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is David Tuch. His last name is spelled Tuch, but it's pronounced Tuck. And if you're watching this on YouTube, Rockfin, Rumble, X, Twitter, you'll see the title and cover of his new book. The full title is The Wireless Operator, the Untold Story of the British Sailor Who Invented the Modern Drug Trade. And I was reading through the book, and it has some interesting names in it. He also has an interesting blurb from a guest who I've had on, as Tim Tate, who I've had on recently, To Catch a Spy. And just the blurb that Tim Tate wrote is David Tuch brings the remarkable story of Harold Derber, refugee gun runner, ethical people smuggler, and revolutionary drug trafficker out of the shadows. And what a tale it is, an extraordinary life of adventure and misadventure, and a rollicking good read. So that's a great piece of information from Tim Tate, who's a very accomplished author. But David Tuch, this is his first book. He's a cousin of the kind of protagonist in this book. You see his face here. He was born with a different name. But David Tuch is a technology entrepreneur. He was born in New York and received his doctorate from MIT and Harvard Medical School. He lives in Brookline, Massachusetts, with his wife and 4 children. This is his first book. So David Tuch, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the show. Thanks for having me.
Great. So for people who haven't heard your name, this is your first book. Maybe you can talk about your background. You have a great academic career, kind of background, your research, and what led you on to the story about the wireless operator.
With pleasure. Let me begin by mentioning never in 1,000 lifetimes did I think I'll be writing about true spies and gun running and drug trafficking. I'm a science and technology entrepreneur by background. I sold my company in 2023, and I was thinking about what's next in life. And I was doing some family genealogy research just out of curiosity. And I was exchanging notes with a distant cousin. And towards the end of the conversation, he said almost kind of off the cuff, "Oh, by the way, you should look into our mutual cousin, this guy named Harold Derber. He was a drug trafficker, gun runner, shot down in Miami." And it was kind of one of those bits of family folklore. You didn't know whether or not to take it seriously or not. And I checked in with another cousin, and she said, "Oh yeah, he used to run guns for Castro. You didn't know that?" So that was kind of one of those introductions that was really impossible to turn away from. And I started off with just an internet search, and there was almost nothing on him, just a few hits. And I thought, okay, that's tantalizing, but not sure where to go from there. And I started digging into the archives, first the British archives, then the American archives, went through old newspaper clippings. And before I knew it, I was speaking with his former criminal associates. I tracked down the memoir of his lover. I was doing freedom of information requests to the CIA and FBI. I was able to track down the undercover agents who pursued him. And the story that ultimately emerged is one of the most insane stories I've ever come across in fact or fiction. And I became so obsessed with the story, I dedicated myself full time to chronicling the life of my cousin. And that became The Wireless Operator, which has been out in the UK for a couple months now and just hit the US shelves this week.
Right. So it's just been published on Amazon. And tell the story of his background. He was British by birth, right? A Jewish British guy who kind of came out of World War II, right?
That's right. He was born in Manchester, England, in the Jewish quarter called Cheetham Hill. His birth name was Hyman Tuch. So his last name, Tuch, is actually the origin of my name as well. So he took, the British side of the family took the suffix, which was Derber. He would eventually become Harold Derber. And my side of the family, which is on the German side, took the prefix, which was Tuch, or Tuck as it's pronounced in English. So he was born Hyman Tuch in 1926, Manchester, England. So came of age right at the time of the breakout of the war. And Manchester in particular was a pretty wretched place to be during the war. So in addition to the Blitz and the evacuation, Manchester also had the British Union of Fascists, so Sir Oswald Mosley and the Black Shirts. And one piece of information I discovered during my research for this book was there were actually Jewish internment camps in England. Very few people are aware of that. So the British interned about 8,000 Jews because they were nominally of German or Austro-Hungarian descent without distinguishing between people that were sympathetic to the Nazis or not. So although he wasn't interned, members of his family were interned. And so that was the sort of specter hanging over the family. And so with all of that terrible stuff going on, decides at the very tender age of 16 to enroll in the wireless college to become a radio officer in the British Merchant Navy. And then he ships out, serving first with the Dutch merchant fleet and then the Norwegian merchant fleet during the Battle of the Atlantic. And so you have to imagine just how wretched that experience was. So the merchant Navy ships were, if you imagine like the worst dive bar you've ever been into, just really, really deprived conditions. And then you're with a bunch of, 2-meter tall Dutch sailors out in the middle of the Atlantic, and people are firing torpedoes at you on top of it. So that was his first encounter with radiocraft, and he would become a highly, highly accomplished seaman. So he became a radio officer at the very young age of 22, as well as a master mariner and a certified navigator. He would claim he was the youngest certified navigator in either the British Merchant Navy or the Royal Navy. And the British Merchant Navy, the merchant navies in general, had an extremely high fatality rate. I think they're one of the main unsung heroes of World War II. So the Norwegian merchant fleet, which he served with, had the highest fatality rate of any service, even though it was a civilian service. So they actually even had a higher fatality rate than the RAF pilots. I think 1 in 6 Norwegian merchant seamen perished during the war. So really just tough going. He manages to survive the Battle of the Atlantic, and then from there embarks on a very interesting career in arms smuggling and other illicit ventures, which I'm sure we'll get into.
He was kind of like the international man of mystery, like moving around different countries, Israel, America, Cuba, with this kind of maybe supranational connections too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Had this amazing knack for finding, where the next global flashpoint was going to be. So after World War II, the next state conflict was the Arab-Israeli War. So in 48, when Israel declared independence, he signed up to serve with the Israeli Navy as a radio operator and later as a boat captain. So at the outbreak of the war, the Western powers imposed an arms embargo against both Israel and the neighboring Arab states. The idea was to create a level playing field and hopefully drive the warring parties to a negotiated stalemate. And Israel embarked on the largest illegal arms smuggling campaign in world history. So many thousands of tons of arms were procured illegally from the US and from Nazi surplus, actually, in order to illegally arm the fledgling Israeli military. So he was part of that illegal arms smuggling campaign, and in particular taking some of the Nazi surplus that Stalin had seized in Czechoslovakia and secretly redirecting that to Israel against the embargo. And it was also kind of crazy because the arms embargo was manned by the British Royal Navy and the American Navy to a lesser extent, and also the Arab nations. And so you had this very incongruous situation where you had British sailors trying to run through the blockade manned by other British sailors that they were, they'd been fighting shoulder to shoulder with just a few years ago. And this was really his first foray into illegal arms smuggling, and it didn't stop there. So after the war, he took advantage of this loophole to whitewash German arms sales through Israel onward to, in this case, the dictatorial government of the Dominican Republic under Rafael Trujillo. He had a $41 million line of credit from Trujillo. So this is in 1950s dollars. So that would be about $500 million today, in order to procure arms for the Dominican Republic. And that was really his first sort of step into illegal arms trafficking. And so we talked about how he was really adept at finding the next global hotspot. So he continued to do illegal arms smuggling and did like a career rotation in illegal ventures. You know how when you're in high school and they let you sample different careers? So he did that across the whole spectrum of different illegal trades, including stock fraud, corporate espionage, smuggling contraband oil into the Soviet bloc. And then The next destination was New York. So he served in the Merchant Navy until the mid 1950s and then moved to New York with a friend he had met in Israel during the Arab-Israeli War. And they set up shop in the Bronx, actually. And there's a funny side note here, which is that the two of them befriended a young film student who recently graduated from Hofstra. And they produced this young film student's first two movies. One was a softcore porn film, and the other one was a cowboy nudie film. And that young film student was Francis Ford Coppola.
Wow.
So they produced Coppola's first two movies.
Wow,
and
that's
so,
amazing.
yeah, so they're hanging out in New York for a while. And then
Was that Dementia 18 or whatever? Was that the one?
so one
Their
was
titles.
yeah, so one was the softcore porn film was called The Peeper.
People.
And the second one, which was his first sort of major debut, was called Tonight for Sure. It's a cowboy nudie film.
Okay.
So his Israeli friend actually has a movie credit on IMDb, but he kept his name secret.
Interesting.
So from there, the next global hotspot is the Cold War in the Caribbean. So after the Bay of Pigs invasion, he heads down to Miami, Florida, and because tourism essentially collapsed during the Cold War, he was able to secure a charter on a luxury cruise ship for a deep discount and ran a floating casino that ran between Miami Pier 3 and the Bahamas. And it's at this time that he meets the love of his life, a woman named Sari Leslie, whose real name was Sari Cohen. And she and her identical twin were recruited to be entertainment directors on his boat. But she had a secret. So she was secretly contracted, most likely to the CIA. And she was using his cruise ship as a cover to run cash and corporate documents out of Havana, using his cruise ship to get back into Miami. And they embarked on this passionate, madcap love affair. And tourism, when the Cuban Missile Crisis struck, tourism just absolutely cratered. And he lost his first boat, was able to secure a second cruise ship. And many people forget this chapter of the Bay of Pigs invasion, but after the invasion force was captured, 1,100 members of the brigade were held in prison in Cuba in the Isle of Pines. And the Kennedy administration secretly negotiated through back channels to free the Bay of Pigs prisoners and have them freed to America. But the key thing is they wanted to have separation from the White House. And so they put out a call for anyone with a private ship close to the Caribbean that was willing to transport back the Bay of Pigs prisoners. And my cousin wrote a telegram to JFK, as one does, volunteering a ship to transport back the prisoners. And it was accepted. And then for some reason that I haven't been quite able to figure out, they reneged on the deal. I think Castro might have changed his mind and wanted to transport the prisoners by air. But they said, okay, you're off the assignment. You can't transport the prisoners. And he said, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And they said, well, you can't do that because of the travel embargo, the trade embargo with Cuba. You can't conduct business with Cuba. And he said, well, actually, that only applies to U.S. nationals. I'm a British national. I'm not a U.S. subject. So the Kennedy travel embargo doesn't apply to me. And so I'm going to go ahead and do it. And he signed a exclusive agreement with the Cuban government to provide the only transportation out of Cuba. Amazing. Yeah.
So he's right in the thick of all that stuff.
Right. This is right after the missile crisis. And this is when the full weight of the CIA and the State Department come crashing down on him. And he's harassed and brutalized and suppressed all across Bahamas, the Caymans, and eventually sets up operations in Jamaica because they had separated from the British Crown in 62. And he does a test ferry operation with 24 Cubans. And he's successful to bring them to America. And they can't figure out what to charge him with. So the situation was there were 250,000 Cubans with visas, so they were legally allowed to enter the U.S. But because there was a travel embargo, there was no practical way for them to come in. And so the government had been sort of trying to play both sides of the issue. And so they charged him with some completely bogus charge of failing to give the port 24 hours notice, which is just absurd. And the jury's hung, but then they eventually deport him as a national security risk. And he's deported back to England. And this is when his trafficking and smuggling career takes on a completely new dimension.
He'd had all the experience of smuggling people and guns and things like that. So Probably it must have been being in Jamaica must have opened his eyes to maybe some new opportunities with their own harvest, so to speak, a green harvest.
Yeah, that's right. So he's deported to England in 1964 as a U.S. national security risk, and he hadn't seen his folks in 20 years since he left to fight in World War II, and doesn't stay there very long. He ends up spending time in Canada, trafficking in stolen or fraudulent bonds. Finds his way to Suriname, and then spends time in Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, Colombia. He's variously jailed in all of those countries for months at a time. And then something really remarkable happens in 1970. So in 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which was an attempt to rationalize all of America's drug laws into a single coherent framework. And as part of that, they nullified all of the previous drug laws. And they screwed up royally because they canceled the law that made it illegal to have drugs in international waters. And they forgot to replace it. So it was just an administrative screw up. And because of that, it became legal to have drugs on the high seas for the first time. And my cousin realized that this was the trafficking opportunity of a lifetime. And he is credited with inventing what is called the mothership technique. So what he would do is he would take a cargo freighter, load it with 40 or 50 tons of marijuana, park it in the middle of the Atlantic, and then have the drug transfer happen mid-ocean to a speedboat or a fishing trawler. And then that boat would take it to shore, but that was somebody else's problem. So he could transport several hundred tons, eventually 2,000 tons of marijuana per year completely legally. So if we look at marijuana consumption in the US, in the late 1960s, only about 5% of high school students had tried marijuana. In the late 1970s, that figure rises to 30 or 40%. So there's this Cambrian explosion of marijuana use in America. And that's usually attributed to the hippie counterculture sort of permeating mainstream society, or the Vietnam vets coming back and maybe self-medicating their PTSD. But on the supply side and the distribution side, it was made possible by the industrialization of maritime marijuana shipping because of this mothership loophole accidentally created by Nixon. So he was able to exploit this with a fleet of a dozen cargo ships. And in order for U.S. law enforcement to charge him, they had to actually witness the drug transfer happening mid-ocean, as well as the drugs arriving to shore, which was impossible. And so exploiting this loophole, he would eventually become the largest marijuana trafficker in American history, moving roughly on the order of 2,000 tons of marijuana.
Where was it sourced? Where was his marijuana sourced?
Yeah, it was sourced in Barranquilla, Colombia. Very initially, to your earlier point, very initially it was sourced from Jamaica. So he was arrested in 74 with 3 tons of Jamaican marijuana. But Jamaica in 1972 or 73, I want to say, clamped down very heavily on marijuana production. And in Mexico, there was a herbicidal eradication program financed by the U.S. government that, and this today, Mexican marijuana still has a very bad reputation because of the herbicidal cross contamination. And so Colombia during that time arose to become the dominant marijuana supplier in the early mid 1970s. And I find this so fascinating because in America, we tend to have 2 narratives about the drug trade. We think of like the 1960s counterculture, and then we flash forward to the ultra-violent Colombian cartels. But there was this period from the early to late 70s where you had these innovative, what they call gentlemen smugglers, essentially pioneering the marijuana trade. Now it's such a mainstream staple of American society, and it's very easy to take that for granted. But these were people that realized this entrepreneurial opportunity to basically provide this growing mass market. So he would rise to become the largest marijuana trafficker in American history, although he ran into one major snag, which is that as his ships were coming up from Barranquilla, they would take the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, and there's only like a 20-mile wide passage in between those 2 territories that's in international waters. So sometimes they would stray into Cuban waters, and they were getting seized by the Cuban government. So both the ships and the cargo and the crew were getting seized. So they had a big sit down in Bogota. It was the Cuban ambassador to Colombia and the major Colombian drug traffickers to come to some kind of understanding. And the outcome was really remarkable. The Cuban government said, well, good news, we're going to release your ships and the crew and the cargo. And even better news, we want to sponsor you. So we'll give you free passage. We'll give you radar cover. We'll give you naval escorts. You can fly the Cuban flag if you want. And we only have two small requests in return. You have to pay a $800,000 docking fee when you arrive in Cuba. And on your return trip from delivering all the weed, you have to supply guns to the Marxist insurgents in Latin America. So this was the first narco-terrorism pact of the Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
So my cousin became embroiled in the Cuban-Colombian guns for drugs trade. So he was delivering weed all up and down the Atlantic seaboard. And then on the return trip, bringing guns to the Marxist guerrillas, principally M19 in Colombia.
So it was like a left wing Iran-Contra or something like that. Like
exactly.
Great underground. Wow.
Yeah. So one historian that I respect very much said, all of American history is Iran-Contra.
No, it's the vast web, but these things are like underneath the surface. So here is Derber doing that same thing.
I think there's some wonderful books on this called, there's one book called The Politics of Heroin, another one called The Strength of the Wolf, that talks about how the CIA in many instances has used drug trafficking to finance their off-book activities.
Probably to this day.
It would not surprise me. And so law enforcement was incredibly frustrated because here you had this major drug trafficker who was openly known to be a major drug trafficker. He was living openly in Miami, so splitting his time between Colombia and Miami. He was living on Brickell Ave in Miami Beach, and they could not locate his ship. They could not. It was like this ghost ship. I've spoken with a number of maritime and Coast Guard officers that described that period, and they're like, we could not find. And so he was using a lot of very sophisticated counter surveillance to avoid detection, and they couldn't locate it. So one North Carolina customs officer got really frustrated, and he wrote a memo proposing that they use military resources to locate his drug ships, in particular to use naval reconnaissance satellites and reconnaissance planes. And this was hugely controversial at the time because this is a clear violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which has come into focus very recently with some of the kinetic strikes that the current administration is taking against drug trafficking.
Wow.
Yeah. And so this memo, because it was a clear violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the use of the military for law enforcement, found its way to the desk of Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State at the time and nominally head of the drug interdiction program. And Kissinger approved it in an ultra secret memo. I say ultra secret because I did a freedom of information request to the DEA for any records about this program, which was called Operation Stopgap. And they said, oh, sorry, we destroyed all the records. And likewise, Coast Guard officers have testified under oath that the program never existed. So they used the naval reconnaissance satellites to eventually locate the night train. And the seizure of the night train, which they were eventually successful to find after his death, was a seizure of 54 tons of marijuana, which was the largest drug seizure in American history.
Where did they find it? Where in the ocean did they find the mothership?
So it was off Abaco Island in the Bahamas. So it was actually an undercover operation where they had a group of undercover agents and civilians actually posed as an undercover transfer pickup crew. So they were on a pickup boat called the Catch Lot 2, and they went out to meet the night train. There's a great sort of account of it in the book. Actually, in the book, I have never before published photos of this undercover operation, which yielded the largest drug seizure in American history. So they went to the first location for the rendezvous with the night train. And after a day, it never showed up and they couldn't find it. And then a Navajo plane buzzes overhead and drops 2 water cooler bottles into the ocean with coordinates for the second rendezvous. So there's a redirection. And at the second rendezvous point, they meet the night train and they activate a radio beacon for a endurance cutter called the Dauntless to come and seize the night train, which eventually succumbed. And that's where they found the 54 tons of marijuana.
And that's like north of Nassau, right? So kind of in those Grand Bahama area.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's up there. I mean, this predates all the cocaine trade and all that stuff, dude. This is really,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Pablo Escobar's trafficking contraband cigarettes at this point, right? There's
At
no
the same time.
right? There's no Medellin cartel. There's no cocaine. There's no heroin. I mean, I say no, but just minuscule amounts. So that doesn't really take off until
The 80s, right?
Yeah,
Or late 70s or 80s.
yeah, you see signs, very early signs in 76, 77, and then it takes off. And what's so fascinating is that my cousin's infrastructure with the exploiting the mothership loophole then became the infrastructure for the Medellin cartel and
the model for the Medellin, right? So
exactly, because this is before the submarines. It wasn't enough for land transport. The legal loophole, would not be closed until 1980 with the passage of the Marijuana on the High Seas Act. But very interestingly, they only closed the loophole for marijuana. So the mothership loophole still existed for other drugs. So they're still able to exploit it. That's also why drug imports also shifted for marijuana, also because it's more profitable and had more profit density, shifted to cocaine. But it was also because of the Marijuana on the High Seas Act closed the loophole specifically for marijuana.
Wow. It's still relevant. This is all this stuff happening out of Venezuela and stuff. This
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
totally.
I mean, we take it such for granted. I mean, I know there's a very really vigorous debate happening now about the legality, but we take it such for granted now, even with language about the war on drugs, that it's permissible to use military resources and methods for drug interdiction. But at the time, it was so controversial that the government would keep it ultra classified and swear up and down it never existed.
Right. And how did he launder his money? Like, I mean, that's one of always the big challenge of these guys who are in the underground kind of dark trades or whatever.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. So the DEA estimated he had about $300 million in addition to his fleet of cargo ships, plus he had holdings in a wide number of private companies and real estate. So 300 million, that's probably about 2 billion in today's money. And so he laundered it through a penny stock brokerage called First Jersey Securities, which was a pump and dump scheme eventually. That brokerage, First Jersey Securities, would eventually go on. So he actually provided the cornerstone funding for First Jersey Securities. And that brokerage would eventually go on to become the largest securities fraud in American history, about $400 million, which doesn't move the needle today for financial fraud. Back then, $400 million was serious.
A lot. We trillions now, banking crisis or whatever. But so First Jersey Securities was the name of the enterprise when the securities fraud happened. What year was that? What year did they flop or go under? Or
so I want to say around 83 to 85 time frame. Yeah, so that's very prominent.
Savings and loan kind of time.
Yeah, so you'll find extensive discussions about First Jersey Securities. So he provided the cornerstone funding for that, and then also he laundered his money through First Jersey, and his assets multiplied 7 times over because the president was giving him favorable treatment because he cornerstoned him and was also investing very heavily. And he was also at this point using First Jersey to launder money for the Gambino crime family in New York. And whether or not that was the extent of his interactions with the Gambinos, I don't know. He was under investigation by the New York FBI office for his ties to the Gambino family. And then the SEC, which was investigating First Jersey, became aware that my cousin was trafficking his drug proceeds through First Jersey. And so they included that in their financial investigation, i.e. laundering drug money became one of the investigative topics into First Jersey. And he was called to testify in New York into the SEC investigation.
Wow. So, I mean, he really was a kind of an international, spy, operator, person of intrigue, like a really incredible life, traveling around, smuggling people into Israel, smuggling weed, securities manipulation, hanging out with mob adjacent, these type of things.
Yeah, it's very true. There's a great question in the chat about whether or not it's legal to have cocaine in international waters. First of all, I'm not a qualified lawyer, and I would recommend you get qualified independent legal advice. But the answer to the question is that the loophole for other narcotics wasn't closed until a separate act was passed in 1986.
Gotcha. So there was a separate thing.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
that's right. And so, so I mentioned he was scheduled to testify in this SEC investigation into his money laundering. And then the night before he was scheduled to testify, he was assassinated by professional hitmen outside of his Miami condominium.
That seems to be the thing. If you're testifying in front of Congress, like for anything, like that's like a death knell. Like these people, they don't know. Like the same thing happened during like the Kennedy HSCA stuff. Like all those Roselli, all those guys, or Giancana, like some of them were like scheduled to testify, and like that was it. They're
Yeah.
gone. So he was taken out right around that time as those guys too. So
Yeah.
late 70s. Yeah.
And
Wow.
it's interesting because I don't, he had so many enemies. So he was being encircled by the Colombians, the Cubans, potentially the Gambinos, and potentially, very potentially any figures related to the SEC investigation. So it could be very coincidental timing, or even a cover that he was assassinated the day before the investigation, because it could have just easily been any one of the other groups targeting him. But it's definitely very interesting timing for sure.
Yeah, pro hit. And then what happens to his extensive estate?
Yeah. So how come I'm not a multi-billionaire?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Somebody else got it, I guess.
Yeah. So there's a very fascinating story there. So his supposed wife, and I'll explain why I say supposed in a minute, claimed the estate, and then my relatives sued the estate to get access to the funds, and she claimed that they were married in Colombia but couldn't produce a marriage certificate. So the court ruled that she wasn't the rightful heir. But when my relatives went to access the accounts, they're all completely wiped clean. So all the money in the Panamanian bank accounts was gone. All of the stock certificates in the safety deposit boxes in the Miami banks was gone. So where it went, I don't exactly know. That's one of the open questions in the book. But unfortunately, it didn't land in my bank account. And interestingly, so he had a done man switch, which was a set of secret documents that were set to be released if he met his untimely demise. And even after he was assassinated, some of the criminals shot at his supposed wife, trying to find that secret cache of documents. Whether or not they were, who knows? It could have been a bank ledger, it could have been a list of informants, account numbers, who knows? So that kind of, I don't know if that argues against it being the Colombians, because what interest would they have in these secret documents? But yeah, that's one more piece of the puzzle.
Wow, it's remarkable. It wouldn't be the first time money has disappeared out of Panama or Panamanian banks.
Yeah. So Noriega was.
Yeah. I mean, they used to trust the banks there, but now it's like, I mean, this is your website too, David, right? So this is it. It's really a nice, great looking website. It's at DavidTuch, TUCH.com. A lot of pictures. There he is right there. So
yeah, that's
video and pictures.
So that was back in the day when you could wear sunglasses and smoke in a courtroom.
Very cool.
So Miami-Dade Community College has a film archive from Miami NBC News. So we were able to source a lot of video, mostly from his Cuban refugee smuggling period. I was very happy to include in the
That's
report.
great. A lot of great pictures, things like that. A lot of pictures of that era and time too, the Revolutionary era. Wasn't this guy Donovan kind of associated with Durban?
Yeah. So I mentioned that my cousin was responsible, or he was assigned to return the Bay of Pigs prisoners. So James Donovan was the one that negotiated with Castro for the return of the Bay of Pigs prisoners. So we probably know Donovan from the Spielberg movie Bridge of Spies. So he was responsible for the spy swap for the KGB station chief of the U.S. But they brought him out of retirement to negotiate with Castro for the Bay of Pigs prisoner release. And that's what made my cousin so furious. So the U.S. government paid $43 million in ransom to Castro to free the Bay of Pigs prisoners, right? And my cousin wanted to transport, starting with a few dozen Cubans that had visas, that were anti-communist, had every legal right to enter the U.S., and he was harassed, demonized, charged, deported for doing very much what Donovan had done, but on much more kind of ethical grounding. So in the book, I sort of pose Donovan and Derber as sort of counterpoints. Donovan was this establishment figure working closely, albeit secretly, for the Kennedy administration, and my cousin was much more of a sort of a rabble rouser, maverick type, trying to accomplish something that was arguably even more humanitarian, but faced the full wrath of the U.S. government.
Derber could easily pass for a Cuban just at first glance. Like, he really looks Cuban. Like,
yeah. So
right along.
this is a great photo. So the figure on the left, who is one of his close friends and allies, is the founder of the Cuban intelligence service. So this is a fellow named Captain Victor Pina, who was a proto-communist prior to the revolution, fought with Castro during the revolution, and then with Che Guevara, founded the Cuban intelligence service, DGI. He would later go on to become the Minister of Transportation and was the co-signatory on this exclusive agreement to provide my cousin the sole transportation rights out of Cuba. And I was very fortunate because I befriended Captain Pina's son in Havana, and he shared with me this photo and the other photos and the correspondence between the two. So I just love the incongruity. You have this British gentleman with a pencil mustache and the bow tie, parting with one of the leading intelligence figures in Havana.
It's remarkable. This guy's incredible. He's like James Bond. But do you think that he had kind of left-leaning outlook, or was he mercenary, kind of like do whatever to make the most money? Or do you think he found sympathy with the Cubans? What are your thoughts?
It's such a fascinating question. I've been studying this guy for years, and I'm not any close to answering the question. I think his ideology was money. I think he was very financially motivated. In intelligence circles, they have this acronym to describe people's motivations: MICE, money, ideology, coercion, and ego. So I think for him, it was probably 90% money and maybe 10% ego. He had this knack for finding loopholes. So the mothership loophole was a loophole. Transporting Cuban refugees as a British subject and avoiding the Kennedy trade embargo was a loophole. Having casino gambling in international waters was a loophole. Whitewashing German arms sales through Israel was a loophole. So I think he was sort of this gadfly, operating on the border between legality and illegality. And he probably did that, because of the opportunity, but also some of the intellectual gratification that came from sort of skirting around the law. But he had a very strong money lust, so he was very, very financially motivated, and I think that's what drove him. And it's fascinating because during the Cuban refugee operation, he justified what he was doing by waving the flag for anti-communism and fighting Castro. And I think a lot of that was just posturing for the Miami Herald. I'll tell you something nuts, which is that there's one U.S. intelligence report, which I haven't seen firsthand, but was reported on by the Atlantic Constitution, that claims, and I want to stress that this is just a claim, this intelligence report says that Derber was the KGB head for Miami. Yeah, and I take that with a lot of salt because Russia had a negligible intelligence presence in Florida because that was largely dominated by Cuban intelligence, and they operated largely separately during that time period. And there was obviously no consul in Florida, so he would have been operating without diplomatic immunity and so on and so on. So I'm expecting, I did a freedom of information request for his CIA file, which I'm expecting middle next year. So watch this space. Maybe we'll learn more on that question. His NSA file is still classified. So I'm preparing a lawsuit to get access to his NSA file, because that's the fascinating bit. So he'd been deported from America twice. The second time is a national security risk. He had been barred or deported from a dozen countries, right? He had served jail time in half a dozen countries, and then he's readmitted to the U.S., right, in 1973. Right. And he's operating openly in Miami as the largest marijuana trafficker in America. So it strongly suggests, and the DEA very, very heavily stonewalled his murder investigation. Also, I didn't mention his lookalike. He had a double who was also murdered 5 months prior to his own assassination. And the DEA also stonewalled the investigation into his lookalike. So it's not conclusive yet, but there's more and more evidence that he is possibly being protected by the DEA or another agency. Otherwise, it's really hard to understand how he could be living openly in Miami as the country's largest drug trafficker.
Right. Wow. So he's just playing all the different people, like the triple agent or quadruple agent or
Yeah, yeah, and I
wow.
think he told his trafficking buddies, many of whom I spoke with for the book, that he was actually arming the counterinsurgents in Latin America.
Right. So he's
Um,
playing both sides. So
yeah, and so that
like
so that might be
that's
why the government.
classic
Yeah, yeah, so that
black
might be why the government
marketeer.
was
Yeah.
protecting him. If they said, okay, well, turn a blind eye to his drug trafficking, if he can arm some of the pro-government militias in Colombia, because the pro-government militias wanted to, the Colombian government wanted to avoid any outward appearance of connection with America. So they would create these back channels for arming the pro-government militia. So, don't have a completely clear picture on that. He might have just been saying that to save face in front of his trafficking buddies. But it's one more piece of the puzzle for sure.
Yeah, wow. So he's trying to get benefits from both sides. I mean, that would be like the classic black marketer, where he's getting benefits from Cuba and the U.S. government
Yeah.
by just being whatever he wanted to both of them. Really,
Yeah.
an interesting, great story. This is a picture you used for the cover of your book. We are at the 40-minute mark. Is there anything you'd like to add, or before we wrap it up? Where can people find the book, and where can people find you?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much. This is a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot. So the book is available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. It's available both in hard copy, audio, and Kindle. So just in time for a holiday present for your loved ones or some holiday reading. I can also encourage listeners to visit our webpage at davidtuch.com. Tuch is Tuch, and you can sign up to our newsletter where we update our readers on new intelligence documents that we find as they become available. So we just got a document drop from the CIA last month, and so we'll continue to work with our readers to unravel the puzzle.
Yeah, and then these documents, these FOI documents, are such an important part of history too. Because I've been going through some for other figures. A lot of the stuff is like coming to the surface recently. Like
Yeah.
some of these documents really open up our understanding of history, much like this book does. But David, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Again, the
Cool.
authors. Anything else you'd like to add
No,
before?
just it's been great, Bill. Thanks a
Okay,
lot.
all right, cool. He'll stay here. Again, the author's name is David Tuch, Tuch. And the title of the new book is The Wireless Operator, The Untold Story of the British Sailor Who Invented the Modern Drug Trade. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
All right, stay there. Stay there.